I didn't know how to do this episode at first. And then I discovered a way to do this episode. People are going to be angry. People are going to be angry in a second. So, as a preamble, I've had a lot of requests for this episode. A ton. In our email, in our Facebook, every time I say, give me an episode request. Never understood how to do this episode until very recently, when I came up with a way to do it. So this episode, it's called The Metagame for Beginners. So if you're already familiar with the metagame, this episode is going to be a little bit boring for you. You might learn some new things on ways to think about how to play the metagame and everything like that. But I just realized that the whole time I've been doing this show, I have been teaching people or explaining things that are happening in the metagame. But that's always been with the, hey, I'm coming to this game for the metagame. So it's time for me to actually discuss, to those of you who aren't familiar with what the metagame is, or how to play in the metagame itself, the competitive metagame. I do have to preamble this episode. The skills that are explained in this episode, and any episode of Metafix, are not intended for casual play at the table, are not intended for tournaments where you already have the prize, or not for, like your weekly game. What you learn in this show and this episode is primarily involved with high-level tournaments, ROCs, nationals, event tournaments, worlds, that kind of stuff. So, I guess we got to get into it. So, the first step in learning how to play the metagame, we had these comic book characters on these figures. We have to forget that there's comic book characters attached to this. So anybody who just went, oh my goodness, yes, I'm doing this to Major Victory. Very high-level meta piece right now. Very decent character. Another issue, his name is Major Victory. Let's, yeah. No, he's not. He's character number 005, worth 95 points with a lot of stats. One of the things about the metagame, in order to separate yourself when you're playing competitive versus just loving this game, every so often when it comes to high-level competition, you kind of have to step aside and step away from what these things are. When you're playing a high-level competition, when your goal is to win, you got to lose the attachment that these are comic book characters. Yes, it's very cool. This game is based on comic book characters. There's nothing really to be, shot down about this. I love the game because it's comic book characters. But also, every so often, I go to nationals. Every so often, I'm planning on going to an ROC March 7th down in Windsor, March 7th, 2014, so that I don't totally date this video. 2015, to play in the pre-April ROC. So, we've removed the name and removed the figure from this. So now it is a dial with some stats. That's the most important thing you got to be looking at in the metagame. And then, now the numbers are kind of the important part. You got point values, you've got numbers, and you got all these powers on the card. Now I also brought this marker for the card here because his name's on the card again, so we're going to get rid of that. Yeah, that's gone. And then his character, yeah, look at that. That's gone too. Can someone tell me when I am? Well, that's running shot, so let's just get rid of all that jazz. That's just running shot. I don't know if you can see this properly in the camera. I'm ticking so many people off with this episode already. That's one of the first steps for beginners. Getting into high-level play, competitive play, is you do have to step away from the game and say, okay, I gotta stop thinking about these guys like comic book characters, and it's time for me to start thinking about them like game pieces. So, now when you're doing that, I've explained a couple of things that exist in the game. One of the terminologies I did an episode on was called min-maxing. Now what that is you want to pay the minimum amount of points for the maximum amount of output. So whenever you're building your team in the 300-point range, you want to take a figure. When you take a figure, you got to look at that figure and say, what does this figure do? Can I get it done for cheaper and for more effectiveness? And then things like depth of dial are things to take into consideration. And, the team abilities are important too. Like, sometimes a team ability can come in really handy. Like, the Power Cosmic is a team ability that's really awesome. But don't forget that Hydra's also a team ability that's really good. PD is a team ability that's absolutely amazing. Wild Card, if you have other guys with team abilities, there's things that are important. And it's it's another thing too, you gotta kind of step away from making a team that you've read in a comic book. Don't get me wrong, I love comic books again, and I really have to reinforce it. I do love the casual play ever so often, but I'm trying to teach guys how we get into the high-level play, and sometimes a mindset you've got to take. So, step 1, remember, forget that there's a character attached to it. Step 2, forget that character's name, because it's really not a concern. Then you got to pay attention to the powers, pay attention to the numbers on the dial, and that's really a lot of what it takes to jump into the metagame. The second part is being familiar with what's being played. Now this is the trickier part. If you're not a regular on HC Realms, you don't have a lot of Heroclix groups on your Facebook account, it's time to start joining those, it's time to start discussing the game, and it's time to start discussing the game as a competitive level. And at first you're not going to want to join in the conversation. At first you're going to want to pay attention to the conversation. And the reason you want to do that is a lot of what's being said, and especially when you get into repeated conversations, is anything that's being repeated is what a lot of people are doing. A prime example, in the current metagame, late 2014, Iron Pharaoh is still a very relevant character. Now the reason Iron Pharaoh was relevant is because he doesn't have to leave his starting area, his numbers are relatively decent, his point value is awesome, and in the modern metagame he's got a lot of keywords that are very common. As well, once you throw an entity on him, because opposing characters are going to often be carrying entities, he does get extra stats for attacking those characters. So, these are the things to consider when Iron Pharaoh would be being considered as one of those meta pieces. And then, when you think about that, it's time to think about what ways you can come up to beat that, or what ways you have to play with that. Now, Iron Pharaoh is one of those examples of a character who kind of raises the bar on the cost of entry. That can deter a lot of people from playing in the high-level meta. But there are teams that are out there that don't use a character like Iron Pharaoh. There was one team that made it pretty far using Bullseye, Bill, Major Victory, and Blind Owl and Weasel. The unfortunate part of right now in the metagame is that entities are prevalent. They're really good at boosting some stats. So one of the things you got to think about when you're playing in this game is, am I going to be one of the guys that gets the entities, or am I going to be one of the guys that figures out how to beat the entities? One of the tricks, of course, to beating the entities are things like the Book of Skulls. Entities make numbers bigger. Book of Skulls makes numbers irrelevant. And then again, when you're playing with the Book of Skulls is a rare resource where it's not like a lot of other resources where you can put it on your team. You kind of have to build your team for it. That one, and I think the Phoenix Force is kind of like that to a degree. I wouldn't personally build a team around the Phoenix Force. I'd more often find myself putting the Phoenix Force on a team. But when a resource talks about a lot of characters, a lot of the time you find yourself building your team with the resource in mind. But that's not necessarily the most important thing when you're building a team. Resource is a good thing, but a resource isn't necessarily the way you have to build your team. I use the Book of Skulls as an example of, it's the rare resource that you do have to build your team around. The utility belt, the way to look at it is because it only targets one character, you want it to be a tentpole-y, strong, first top-level character. And you want that character to come in and smash somebody over the head with a baseball bat. As well, you got things like the power batteries, they go on every team. I don't care who you are, I don't care where you're from. Those power batteries can fit on a lot of teams. And they can be probably the last thing you throw on your team when you're putting your team together. So those are my thoughts. Those are things to put in your head with regards to bringing the metagame into beginners. The metagame itself is thinking about the characters without the bases. These are cool, characters on the base, whatever, but sometimes you just kind of take it apart and say, alright, what am I going to do with these numbers on my team? And when you talk about the greater meta, you're talking about what the competitive players are playing. So I'm hoping that a lot of you guys who are just getting into the competitive metagame take away from this that it's okay to play in the competitive meta. It is hard to kind of distance yourself from the comic books at first, but eventually you'll do it, and you'll start to see these characters as numbers at times. Now, ending it all off with a caveat. I personally love the comic book characters that are on here, but I do also love competitive play. So you'll see lately, I've been playing with Amber. A lot of my teams have just been more casual. I've been playing a lot of just dials teams. Kind of been skipping the resources, kind of been skipping entities of late. We had team-based week last week, which your comment section was wonderful. I love you guys. I hate you guys. But that's out of our hair now. But I do know that sometimes I like, when I go to the competitive play, it's time for me to turn on the A game, and I do have to step away from the comic book characters. But that's never stopped me from liking the guy on the dial once I get in there. This game has taught me. Oh God, I'm going on a rant, but I have to. This game has taught me more about some comics that I didn't read before than anything else I could ever think of when I was reading comic books beforehand. So when you go into the high-level meta competitions, understand that it's one of those, it's like the Fight Club thing, you know? You go in there, you beat the crap out of each other, and you're all friends afterwards. Metafix is brought to you by Majestics Comics, Collectibles, and Games down in Costa Mesa, California, near the Orange County Fairgrounds, where they play Heroclix 3 times a week in that store. Don't live anywhere near Costa Mesa, California, or the Orange County Fairgrounds like us? Check down below, we have a link to their web store and their eBay store, where they're always updating with all kinds of new Heroclix singles. Patrick's winning them all the time, so it's a good time to check whenever there's a big tournament around and he's winning.